Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and welcome to tonight's event, Innovating for Social Equity, the Responsibility of the Business Community, hosted by the Restandi Center for Social Sector Innovation and the George J. Stigler Center for the Study of the Economy and the State. I'm Carolyn Grossman, Executive Director of the Restandi Center and an Adjunct Assistant Professor of Strategy here at Chicago Booth. For those of you who are interacting with the Restandi Center for the first time tonight, we are the Social Impact Hub at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, and we're here for people committed to tackling complex social and environmental problems. We're an important part of the university's social impact ecosystem, and we promote innovation, advance research, and develop the people and practices that can accelerate social change. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Stigler Center, the center is dedicated to understanding the issues at the intersection of politics and the economy. And through research support, analysis of data and economic trends, courses, events, initiatives, and multiple resources, the Stigler Center is a destination for research on regulatory capture, crony capitalism, and various forms of subversion of competition by special interest groups. We're so thankful to the Stigler Center for being such a strong partner and for helping bring tonight's event to life. If you've joined us for our previous Innovating for Social Equity sessions, you'll probably remember that we launched this series to examine a central question. With billions spent by the public, private, and philanthropic sectors, why do profound disparities persist? Our first two sessions looked at the role of philanthropy, private market investors, and entrepreneurs in addressing social inequity. Tonight's conversation will focus on the role of the business community in driving forward change. I also want to acknowledge that this conversation is taking place during the month of February. Black History Month is a time to celebrate and remember the many contributions of the African American community. It's also a reminder that we have a lot of work left to do to combat racial inequity. Tonight, we'll consider the role global business leaders can play in building equity. For many years, corporations have relied on corporate social responsibility programs, which include social issue marketing, philanthropic efforts, sustainability initiatives, employee volunteer initiatives, and diversity and inclusion work to build their brands and satisfy customers. But today, many are asking if the business community has a responsibility to do more to address in a systemic way the deep racial and social inequities embedded in our society. And after countless corporations and businesses have come out with statements and initiatives that promise change, what efforts are most promising to change the current trajectory of inequality and structural systemic racism? We've convened a terrific panel to address this topic. Our moderator is Brian Fabes, Managing Director of the Corporate Coalition and Civic Impact Executive in Residence at the Restandi Center and at the Harris School for Public Policy. Brian will facilitate our conversation with Mark Hoplamazian, President and CEO of the Hyatt Hotels Corporation, Paula Price, Public and Private Company Independent Board Director and Strategic Advisor, and Professor Luigi Zingales, the Robert C. McCormick Distinguished Service Professor of Entrepreneurship and Finance and Faculty Director of the Stigler Center. We're also excited to hear from all of you about questions you may have. So after our panelists discuss a series of questions, we'll leave some time to take questions from all of you. If you have a question, please submit it during the webinar via the Q&A chat function within Zoom, and we will try to get to as many questions as time allows. With that, let's dive in, and I'll turn it over to Brian and the panelists.
Thanks, Carolyn, and thanks everyone for joining us. I could not be more thrilled to be part of this conversation. It's such an important topic and such an incredible set of people to talk with about it. And so I just want to dive in and maybe just start with Paula, with you and Mark as business leaders. Just ask you, what is it that the firms that you are associated with and leading today, what are they doing to increase social equity? Why are they doing it? And importantly, how might this differ from ESG and CSR efforts that you may have seen 1, 2, 3 years ago? Paula, do you want to jump in and
Sure.
after that?
Thank you, Brian, and it's so good to be here virtually with everyone. and very much looking forward to the discussion today. I serve on the boards of a few companies, both publicly traded and private. And so I will be sharing my experience about these companies sort of collectively. I'm not speaking on behalf of any particular company, but I have to say that I have been very pleased with the stances and more importantly, the actions that these companies are taking. I look at them from the perspective of, that each company is at a different point on this social equity journey. And so what is important is that the steps that they now take move them significantly forward from where they started. So for example, all of them have been publicly open in terms of standing against racism, which is an important start because it allows them not only to let their own employees know where they stand as a company, but also to influence the culture of the business world as a whole. So each CEO in their own authentic voice has expressed their views. And I would say that this is, certainly from my perspective, a very welcome change insofar as CEOs who are clearly some of the most influential among us are being more vocal in spaces that they might not have been in the past. They're using their voices and their platforms to promote social change, while at the same time doing all the things that are necessary to deliver shareholder returns. So in addition to that, each company has pulled together goals around representation, for example, and they have been very, very thoughtful in these efforts. It used to be the case that companies would say, oh, it's so hard to find this kind of person, a woman, a Black person, or anyone from an underrepresented group for this particular position or this particular industry. And now what I'm seeing are analyses around how many Black people, for example, are in this particular geography with these academic degrees. So really understanding better what the pool is by the data so that they can improve. And some are increasing their remote hiring in the geographies where diversity is extremely limited within a particular population. So companies they're being more creative. They're developing different programs, participating in existing ones that create runway for underrepresented people. And they're making these goals public. Some will say we're doubling or tripling the representation that we have today in 3 or 5 years. So of course, they have to measure and deliver these results, the same as they would for any other business goal. So what I am seeing is more action to support the words. And this is new, and this is good, and it's very encouraging.
That's wonderful. Mark, do you want to talk a little bit about what Hyatt is doing?
Sure. Thank you very much. And thanks for having me be a part of this important panel. For us, I guess, just as a quick reminder for those who don't know, we are a global hospitality company operating about 1,000 properties in more than 65 countries around the world. So the diversity of our marketplaces and the employee base that we have, and not to mention the guest base that we have, is it's extraordinary. And so I think that's the context in which I'll be making some comments. First and foremost, I think it's for us, it's about purpose as a company. A lot of people, purpose has become a buzzword in recent past, but our journey really started many years ago. And it does answer the essential question as to why you exist as an enterprise. And for us, we define that around our purpose around caring for people so they could be their best. And extending care to someone is very different than just serving them. And in order to be able to care for someone, you have to practice empathy and understand where they're coming from and what their needs are, and then take action against that. And our job really is to help people be their best, no matter what that might look like. In some cases, people are staying with us because they're there for a celebration. In other cases, it's there for a funeral. In other cases, it's there for medical treatment for a family member. There are many different purposes of stay. and many different types of support that people need while they're with us. And so helping people to be their best is really the best way that we can extend ourselves and help to keep them effective in what they need to do. As we reflected on how we can keep our colleagues at their best and how we could care for them, we quickly turned to the idea that the communities in which we operate are the communities in which our colleagues live. And so we need to pay attention to things like the environment. We need to pay attention to things like the education system. And what we really ended up focusing on most of all was every community around the world in which we operate, including in some acute examples in the United States, the opportunity gaps that exist, the income gaps that exist, and the wealth gaps that exist across those communities are extraordinarily wide and have consistently widened over the last 5 to 10 years. And we thought it was an extraordinary opportunity for us because in the hospitality business, you can bring a lot of people who don't have deep skills into your workforce because we have many relatively low skill entry-level jobs, and then help develop them, help build skills, create job pathways, and even careers. So we really focused on that. We created a program called Rise High, which was committed to hiring 10,000 so-called opportunity youth. These are young people, say between the ages of 16 and 24, who are out of school and out of work, and really not a part of the commercial community in their local cities and towns. And we thought if we could actually achieve that, it would represent a pretty significant proportion of the new employees that we expect to hire over that period of time, and could make a really significant difference in the communities in which we operate. I would say in the more recent times, that's translated into a sharper set of diversity, equity, and inclusion goals that were occasioned by the aftermath of George Floyd's murder and the elevated awareness and transparency that I think a lot of people called for and appropriately demand of companies. And as Paula was describing earlier, we are also committing ourselves to representation goals. That is who we employ, who we develop, and who we advance. We're also including who we support, that is philanthropic efforts in our communities, especially those community-based organizations that are supporting some of the hardest hit communities. And the third dimension of it is to pay attention to who we're buying from and who we're doing business with, so that we can elevate minority content in all of our purchasing and procurement activities around the world. So that's really the framing of how we've organized ourselves to move forward. And you also asked why we're doing it. I think there's a really clear and crisp answer to that. First, it does help to fulfill our purpose as a company, because caring for our own colleagues and for our guests means having a vibrant economy and a vibrant local community in which they can visit and enjoy different experiences. But secondly, any economy that is strained by wide variances and wide gaps is not stable over the long term. And so the idea that we can stand by and continue to witness a widening of the opportunity gap in particular in our economy is extraordinarily short-sighted, and we do so only at our own peril. So there's a very practical business imperative to help be a part of something that will close that gap, not just in the US, but in many markets around the world.
Thank you, Mark. Luigi, Mark just said that his business imperative is because of an economic phenomenon or principle that he needs more flourishing communities. How does an economist look at what Paula said and what Mark said and what companies are doing? Does it make sense from an economic standpoint?
Absolutely. I think that, first of all, it's important to remember that religious tolerance in Europe started in the Netherlands in order to attract the most advanced and sophisticated artisans from all over the world. So Spinoza was not only a philosopher, but also a very good producer of glasses and lenses, was attracted from the Portugal because in the Netherlands he could be freely a Jewish person, and in Portugal could not. And the northern part of Europe thrive with all the most advanced and innovating craftsmen because they were more tolerant versus the Southern Europe with the Inquisition and so on and so forth. And from an economic point of view, every form of discrimination is a huge economic loss. And there are plenty of papers showing how much we lose in terms of talents, in terms of productivity. And this is besides the human element, which is important. And I don't want to underestimate and underappreciate that. But even if we are purely and only interested in the bottom line, there are plenty of reasons why we want to fight discrimination. We want to fight races. We want to fight a widening gap, especially in opportunities, because those are people who cannot fully develop their talent, and this is talent loss. So I think there is definitely an economic argument that reaches the bottom line, and Mark is right on that. Second, I see, and Mark is also right in that firms are also organizations that bring together people, and people are driven by things other than money. And it's just all too often we economists end up falling into the stereotypes that men are only driven, or human beings, I should say, are only driven by the maximization of their income. And the irony is that we are the ultimate proof that this is not the case. I could make more money by not being a professor and doing something else. And the reason why I am a professor is because I care things other than money. And so a lot of the people who join the organization that Mark worked for, that Paula worked for, they join also because they want to fulfill something else other than profit maximization. And so, and if these people care deeply about certain values, as they do, they want those values respected and represented in the firms they operate. And I think that that's something that firms are increasingly paying attention to, because especially in the younger generations, this is becoming a very, very important issue.
So let me ask everyone, picking up on that. Is this a phenomenon of companies realizing the things Luigi is talking about that's been building over years? I mean, if it's about generational change, and it's presumably building, or is this something that really had a step change in 2020 between COVID and George Floyd's murder and all of the other things? Is this a step change, or has it been going on for a while? Paula, what do you think?
Yeah, I would say that it is a step change. There has been activity over years. I mean, those of us who have been working for decades and have been involved in this journey for social justice know that we have been laboring around these issues for a very long time. But what the events of 2020, the murder of George Floyd, combined with the pandemic, have allowed us to do is to see with our own eyes, the inequities. I mean, the pandemic itself had a lot of disparities in terms of the effects on Blacks and other groups. So we saw it that way, but we also saw it from the uprisings, all of the uprisings around systemic racism. And all of those things kind of came to bear, where we all saw it over and over in a loop on television with our own eyes. And if we can witness that and not respond to it, then shame on us. But fortunately, we have seen a lot of, as I mentioned before, and as Mark also pointed out, we have seen people responding to this in a way that I think is unprecedented. So I would say this is definitely a step change above and beyond that activity, which has always kind of been there, in some cases under the radar.
Also one of the step changes that I think is clear is, and you mentioned this, Paul, are CEOs and business leaders speaking out and not just in emails, but in changing where they give political contributions and changing policies. And that's certainly been a step change.
Yes,
But,
yes.
but I wonder to any of you, is that putting too much responsibility, frankly, on the business community? Are they stepping into places where they shouldn't be stepping into, and other people have responsibility for that? And what do you guys think about that?
Well, maybe I'll just quickly comment. First, on your prior question, I don't really think of it as either a continued evolution or a step change. I think of it as a point, an inflection point in pace of change, where it was an accelerant. And I think one of the two dimensions of the accelerant were the tremendous raw emotion that people were feeling in coping with COVID. And in our case, the hospitality industry was hit very hard. And so we were at a particularly exposed from an emotional perspective point in time when George Floyd got murdered, because we just effectuated a very large reduction in force. And I think that therefore, the aftermath of George Floyd's murder really left a much more deeply felt emotional response. So many companies, we had DEI initiatives that date back many years. But the resolve and the focus on the necessity of really moving the needle elevated a lot. And part of that was because of how it felt. It wasn't a left brain activation. It was more of a right brain and an emotional activation. And I think that's actually really critical, because we all know when you feel something, you end up acting on it with more resolve. There's more there. With respect to your second question, which is are CEOs verging into areas where they shouldn't go? I personally don't believe that our role as a company or as a leader of a company is to become political. I don't believe that weighing in on politics per se is actually a role that I see as appropriate. I tend to focus on the things that are going to impact my colleagues, our business, which are also impacting our guests and their safety and security, and also their quiet enjoyment of their time with us. And so those topics really, really matter to me, and I will weigh in. And I have taken positions, very public ones, and I'll just give you one example, which is I signed a letter to our former governor in Illinois supporting gay marriage. And the reason I did it is because we have a large community of LGBTQ plus individuals. And I thought that it was absolutely critical to be able to help care for them so they can be their best. And by the way, continue to be able to attract some phenomenal talent who might be LGBTQ plus. And so I thought of it as very, very clearly linked to our business, and something that I believed was really important for the business community at large. And we've not weighed into who we give money to, because we don't make political donations to begin with. So I personally think that there is a line to be drawn, and I think weighing in topics that are relevant to your business and to your workforce and to your customer base is appropriate. Just being political, not appropriate, in my opinion.
I would just add to that businesses operate within context, not within a vacuum. And certainly this past year, the context has been about the pandemic. It has been about systemic racism. And so you have to operate within that context. And in my view, you as a business, CEOs in businesses have a responsibility to be good citizens in the context within which they operate. And if we ever hope to get to equality, human equality, we need leaders of all sorts, including and perhaps especially CEOs, to use their voices and their platforms for the greater good. It's not to say that they stop focusing on shareholder returns, but these things are not necessarily in conflict with each other.
So I agree with Mark that I think was more the murder of Floyd was a and COVID in general was a catalyst of some or accelerator of a change that was slowly taking place, but really accelerated during this period. And I think that part of it is also the education. I live through the education of my children and stepchildren here in the United States. The level of education they receive makes the new generation much more aware of these issues. And so as they come into age, as they become important, they of course have a huge influence on that. And also, I want to say it is no doubt that the disproportionate cost of the police brutality falls on minorities, but this is an issue for all of us. And it says if the police doesn't work, it's not a problem only for Black people, it's a problem for every American citizen and every person living in the United States. And so when the police is abusive, is really abusive to all of us, and business is the first to be concerned about this. When we say, at least in the old days, the conservatives were about law and order, and this is not about law and this is not about order, because there is nothing in the law and nothing in the order that says you should behave like this. In fact, quite the opposite. So I think that this is a fairly uncontroversial issue, as Mark said, is really not political. I think the disappointing fact is that this is in the United States sometimes it's still a political issue, but this is I think pre-political. Is not a Republican or a Democratic issue. At least it should not be. I'm a little bit more concerned about the point that Mark is making about customers, because it could go either way. And it says now he's saying, oh, a lot of our customers are in the LGBTQ plus community, and so we support that. But if the majority of our customers were strict Catholic, you'll be against. And it's just, that's a bit where it's dangerous. That depending on who your customers are, you might go one way or the other on certain issues. So I think that some issues, and I think that one of police brutality is one. I think is, in my view, regardless of who your customers are, is a principle that should apply to everybody, and we should defend as citizen, as corporation, as organization, as anything.
I agree with that, Luigi. And what I would just add, we actually had to confront this issue several years ago. I think it was 2017 or 2018, where we decided to draw a line. And the line that we drew was that we are hosts to groups that have different points of view. And we've got Muslim groups, we have Catholic groups, we have every dimension of religion and societal groups coming through our hotels. And we are not going to stand in judgment or apply some other judgment that overlays that. So I completely agree with you. The place that where we drew the line was hate groups. People whose the groups where the primary role of the organization was to demean, diminish, and otherwise attack another group of people for their beliefs or for their religious followings or otherwise. And it proved to be a challenging thing to gauge, because we can make reference to the FBI list, we can make reference to the ACLU list or other lists that are out there, but ultimately you do have to apply judgment and understand it. But our motivation in that was, first, we have a lot of colleagues who might have been in the targeted group that was being targeted by some of these hate groups, who were extremely uncomfortable being in the same space as people who were expressing a desire to do harm to them. And that we could not allow that to happen, because they are our colleagues, and we again are based on a sense of care. And the second thing that's true is that the same is true for other guests in the hotel at the same time. So we did draw that line. It has had effect on a few different pieces of business, not a huge amount, but some. But that had more to do with a lens of safety and security that was not just physical safety, but also emotional and psychological safety. So I strongly agree with what you said, Luigi, and the way you said it. I agree that we should not be in a position where we're trying to make a gauge about that. But we do draw a line where the principal purpose of an organization is to demean and otherwise attack another group.
Paula, you're involved in many companies, so I know you're not speaking for any particular company, but have you had to grapple with this, what's appropriate and what isn't for us to speak out on?
Yeah, well, each of the companies, I believe, have to grapple with that and to decide, where they will stand on these particular issues. And I said earlier that the companies start on this journey, this social equity journey, from different points. And so what I have seen is some companies have really just gone all out. And they've just declared they're in it. They're taking a stand. They're standing up. I wouldn't say they're taking political stands, but they really are being quite vocal on different platforms about their disdain for some of the things that they're seeing in this world, and in particular, following the George Floyd murder. So some companies have really just gone out there. And then others, hadn't been as vocal about these sort of things in the past. And yet they are equally, appalled. And so they've gone out and they've taken less of an aggressive stand, in terms of the words that they've used. There are people who have grappled with, this whole issue of customers. How vocal should we be about these issues from a political perspective when they're downright horrible, no matter what your political views. Well, I wouldn't say that, but they're downright horrible. How vocal should we be on these issues when we know what's in our hearts? These are difficult issues, especially when you have customers who will vote with their feet. So it is an issue that all companies grapple with, both on my boards and my previous employers. It's a really difficult issue, but each of the CEOs, each of them, to a person, have gone out and they've made statements that reflect their authentic selves and how comfortable they are with these issues. And hard to say if there's a right or wrong. Certainly if something is just evil, then there's no right or wrong. I mean, it's wrong, right? But there are other times when you really have to feel for the position that we're placing CEOs in. So yes, I think that a lot of companies are grappling with this, and made more difficult when you're in the CPG space or the retail space, et cetera.
Brian, if I could just make one quick comment. You were asking about whether companies or CEOs are verging into areas that they shouldn't. I think you have to reflect on some context here. It's very interesting to see the most recent Edelman Trust Barometer results. Employees consider their employers more trusted. They have more trust in their employers than they do in the government. And I think the government has done a lot to earn that distrust or maybe just lack of trust because of some extremely volatile behavior and policies that have been implemented over the last several years. And so I think there's a dynamic here where there's a sense of security that people need to feel, and they're finding it in their employer. And so I think in many ways, companies need to step forward in the face of government institutions and instrumentalities that have failed to actually fill in some important gaps in society. I think the lack of coordination on some really important topics over the last several years has also caused a gap. And companies are sitting by saying, hey, well, that's a problem. We can't move the needle in Washington, D.C., so time to roll up our sleeves and take action against these things. And by the way, that in part is why the Edelman Trust Barometer yields what it does. So I think there's a context here that you need to also take into account as to The behavior.
I think it's really important context, but and I don't think anyone wants to argue against companies doing the right thing. But Luigi, I worry in this that if companies are trying to fill all the roles, if government isn't trusted, how are we building the trust of government? Is there a risk if we say companies are taking on the role because they're more trusted now than government? Does that create some risks in there?
I think there are two aspects of that. Number one is companies have the right to take whatever position they want as long as there is competition in the marketplace because people have alternatives. So if I think if I am a baker and I don't want to sell, let's say that I am a Jewish baker and I don't want to sell my bread to the people who I consider anti-Semite. I think that it's completely in my power to decide not to do that. Whether I'm a corporation or I'm a simple baker at the corner, I think that I have the right to do that. Now, if I am the only provider of food in town, probably it's not a good idea that I have this power because the guy can die. And while sort of we don't want people to be racist, I think that I don't think the punishment should be starvation decided by the private business. Now, of course, it's an exaggeration, but I think that this problem is becoming increasingly important, especially when it comes to news and communication, where the power is extremely concentrated and a few people can decide the fate of billion of human beings. And I think that that is where I am concerned. The second thing I'm concerned is that certain things are done better by the government. In instance, let's think about COVID. I think a response to COVID is better organized by the government than done delegated to the private sector. And I think it's lovely that the private sector decides to ask for masks when you come into the store, and that clearly reduces the spread of the disease. But I don't think it's a substitute for a government providing a good response. So I think there is a risk that as the people trust the government more and more, trust the business more and more, the government becomes more and more marginalized. And while I don't want a government to have too big a role in society, I don't want it to have too small a role either. And I think that one of the lessons that hopefully everybody has learned under COVID is that you do need a government to coordinate a joint response in COVID, because as a friend said, is like in a swimming pool. You can't decide that there is a rule. You cannot pee in half of the swimming pool if the other half has no rules, right? There is literally a spillover. And I think that COVID is the same thing. And so I don't think that we want only business to make this decision when these are important decisions.
Well, I'm told that now that we have an economic analogy of what's going on in our economy, I should switch to the audience Q&A. Thanks, Luigi. So I'm going to start with actually the first one that came through, which harkens back to one of the questions I asked at the beginning. Says, what is different now with diversity and affirmative action and minority set-asides compared to, what is different now with diversity compared to affirmative action and minority set-asides of the 80s and 90s? Anyone, the thoughts on what the conversation, what people are doing today differs from what was happening 20, 30 years ago?
I'll start. I think what is different is really, a lot of things have happened, in the past 20 to 30 years. There's been, a lot of work and research that shows that diversity is actually good for business. There's been research that links diversity to innovation. There's research that links diversity to product profitability. There's all of these different programs that sort of, if you implement these programs for one group, you learn that this is actually good for everyone. And so there's sort of that. There's the acknowledgement that diversity is actually good for business. There is now a renewed, accelerated, call it whatever you will, passion around sort of removing sort of systemic racism And diversity is a part of that. Improving representation is a part of that. The difference is also in terms of how we go about doing it. So many businesses have recognized that we can improve representation, but you hire underrepresented groups, and you don't have any other programs in place, you can't retain them. So there's been an increased focus on inclusivity. There's been increased focus on equity. So it's evolved from these other sort of kind of narrow ways to look at sort of diversity. I forget the terms that you were using, quotas, whatever the terms were, to broadening them. There's diversity, equity, and inclusion. How do you improve diversity? How do you keep it? How do you retain it? And how do you make the culture such that it's not just for the underrepresented population? It's not just improved for them, but for everyone. So there's just a lot more experience, a lot more thought that goes into, how do you think differently about diversity?
If I may add, not for business, but for universities, after all, we are kind of a business too. And I can tell you in the last 30 years, I'm sorry to report that I've been in the business almost as long, there's been a dramatic change in the internalization of certain norms. In a sense, quota did exist in the past, but it was seen as a burden imposed from the outside rather than something that everybody thought was the right thing, very much like in the Paula spirit. And I think that now is not universal, but I would say there is a majority of people in leadership position who buy into this, not just for a formal thing, but for a substantive thing. And that's what makes the difference.
Well said. I fully agree with both Paula and Luigi on this.
There's a question here that is, I think, specific to, I happen to know a little bit about the firms, Paula, you and Mark are involved in, and this is something I know you're working with. This is, what challenges have the panelists faced in creating inclusive jobs and pathways for low-income communities? And how do you measure the success of initiatives in narrowing the opportunity gap? Do you want to take a crack at that?
Paula, if you would.
Sure.
Okay.
I'll start. I'll kick us off. So, there's been just even recently, just a number of programs that have been developed, but also companies are, they've become more involved with existing programs. So nonprofit organizations who have been, working in this space for forever. This is what they do day in and day out. They have a certain expertise. So we see, I see companies reaching out to different organizations who have internships or pipeline programs for underrepresented groups that bring them in and then support them with programming. So that's one way that people are addressing this challenge of, this, how do you improve representation, and how do you keep them, keep these underrepresented population in your group. So that's a challenge, and that's one of the solutions that I see.
Yeah, so I'll add to that and give you a couple of very specific examples. Here in Chicago, I chair a board of Skills for Chicagoland's Future, which is dedicated to actually placing people into jobs, and the vast majority of the people they place are from underprivileged areas, south and west side of Chicago in particular. And a lot of the challenges that are faced there have to do with recognizing, understanding through the practice of empathy and experience what's needed to support people to have a job and to be able to keep a job. A lot of it's transportation, some of it's family circumstantial, and you have to surround people who are coming into the workforce, especially if they're traveling downtown, into the Loop area to show up at a job. You have to really understand what's required to actually put them in a position where they can be successful. The second thing I would say is, don't stop practicing the empathy that you started with, because understanding what their challenges are and then designing around that, because that's the user base that you're really trying to design for, and then surrounding them with effort to inform managers and leaders who are leading the groups that they're a part of or that are intersecting with them is really essential. So I think a lot of it is, this is not a plug and play solution. This is in many cases a very highly customized and purpose suited way of bringing people into the workforce and having them be successful. So does it take extra effort? Absolutely. Is there more of an impact over time? Absolutely. So you get out of it what you put into it, but a lot of it has to do with paying attention and listening very intently.
I'm going to go to a question that I think picks up where we were at the end of our discussion. While companies may seek to be apolitical, many everyday Americans feel politically disenfranchised and feel that corporations do in fact hold tremendous political power. How do you seek to show up as apolitical and yet responsibly wield the tremendous political power you do hold? And Luigi, maybe you can also just talk about your observations of companies who do that well and don't do that well.
I think that I will distinguish between the regulatory business from the business at large, because in the past, for example, Walt Disney was saying, well, Mickey Mouse is not Republican or Democrat, because of course they want to appeal to both sides of the aisle, both as a consumers, but also when it comes to renew the copyright of Mickey Mouse. Which is at the end a monopoly that extracts a lot of rents out of mostly poor people in a way that is extremely, I think, negative for society. So their not being political or not being partisan is actually negative, because what they want to do is push their own interests over the interest of society at large, and I think that's bad. And then most people don't realize that the copyright for Mickey Mouse is extended every time is about to expire. And this is the copyright law, not only in the United States but in the world, is driven by Walt Disney, and they succeed in expanding the copyright for to 75 years, even for production that was done by people who were dead. And so there is no incentive reason. We can discuss, reasonable economists disagree, what is the right length of a monopoly you have to create in order to induce the production of good stuff like Mickey Mouse, okay? But I think that every economist and every actually human being will understand that you cannot increase production out of dead people. Incentives don't work with dead people, unfortunately, because we cannot resurrect them. So extending the copyright of stuff produced by Walt Disney that is dead is not going to increase the creativity of Walt Disney. In spite of that, Walt Disney succeeded not only in passing this in the United States, but in the world at large. And the only function of that is redistributed rents from consumers to producers. I think that is the bad part of business we don't want to see. The good part is when they are engaged in promoting the growth of people that otherwise don't have opportunities, the fact that they fight against races, all the other stuff. So we need to be very careful in realizing that very often business, when it does that, does it because is in its interest, and there is nothing bad with it. It's capitalism, but we cannot rely too much, because certain decision must be done in the political sphere, where the private interest of some individuals don't weight excessively large.
I'll just weigh in on a different dimension of that and say that the way I see it is that the polarization, especially in the United States, although it's happened in many other countries too, has grown significantly and is today at an extremely high level. And often what we see is the reduction of a complex issue to name calling and identification and cubbyholing of people, which really is extraordinarily, it's a big detractor of advancing understanding. There's not much understanding going on. What there is sort of an echo chamber reinforcement of a very narrow set of messages that, by the way, the press is very happy to continue to promote because they're serving their own interests, right? We should also mention here that it is facilitated by and contorted by a press whose only interest is their bottom line. That is what they are serving. And so in a world like that, you have to step back and recognize that, when you start talking about lower income people being disenfranchised, that's not just a racial issue. There are plenty of lower income white people who feel disenfranchised and think that, globalization was their enemy and that Donald Trump was their savior. And because, he took a very anti-globalization perspective and America First perspective. And part of that appeal was, hey, all this globalization stuff is for the elites, but that doesn't help me. And then you could look at the Black Lives Matter movement and say, not the organization necessarily, that's different conversation, but the movement, and mistakenly look at that as purely a economic issue or purely a racial issue. And the fact is that there's a combination of those things, but there are also some very, very basic human justice issues. And so what I would revert to, and what I choose to revert to, is in the context of saying I don't think it's appropriate for companies to be political. What I mean by that is to use the framing of politics, which is very polarized and very strained, as a means of trying to engage on topics that are important. So what do you look to? I think you look to human values. You look to the things that are going to promote a healthier community, a healthier society, a more equitable society. And if you stay at that human level, what's good for the human race, what's good for human beings, and you serve those purposes, and ignore whether it's a Democrat or a Republican idea, or it's a Fox News or a OANN or a CNBC or MSNBC. All of that's irrelevant. And if you come back to the one true north, which is we've got to serve humans and elevate equity over time in order for us to have a healthy society and a healthy commercial base. That's the way I think about it, and I think that's the way we can constructively think about it as companies.
Yes, I agree with that. I think a lot of the issues that we've been talking about as a construct can be put under the big umbrella of human equality. A lot of these issues, and you don't have to politicize them, and nor should they be.
Right.
We're going to have to wrap up. I think we've defined that there's about 20 different conversations that we can have many long meals over. But I want to wrap up on a positive note, because we've also talked about a lot of challenges. Could you each give me one thing that you think makes you most hopeful about the prospects for the business community in increasing social equity in our country? I'll go reverse order from where we just ended. So I'll go Paula, Mark, Luigi.
Sure. What gives me hope are the actions and the passion that I see today over and over again, not just from those of us, as I mentioned, who've been laboring in this field for decades, in the hope that, we might make the world better for the next generation. But the passion is now coming from allies. And we've always had allies, but now we have new allies. And, we have new allies who are in positions of power and authority, and who, in combination with all of us who care about social equity, can really make a world of difference.
Thank you. That's awesome. Mark?
To me, I'm excited about moving past labels that have been attributed in different veins to what this idea of businesses getting much more engaged in social issues is. So it was the face-off between Milton Friedman and his beliefs and what the Business Roundtable espoused a year ago or 2 years ago. It is now being derisively referred to in some conservative press as a false sense of wokeness that is really there for performative reasons and not for substantive reasons. All of that is actually getting overwhelmed with the sense of commitment that people are sincerely bringing themselves to making a difference. And I think that is the groundswell of that, and the numbers of people who are coming at it in a sincere and authentic way is clearly going to, if it hasn't already, overwhelmed all this labeling that people have reverted to. And I think that's great, because once we get over that, then we can stop fighting about what to call it or how to refer to it and actually get to work on what's needed going forward.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Mark. Luigi?
I think the students, both the undergraduates and the MBA students that I teach every year, they are getting much more aware, much more involved, much more passionate about these topics. They are the leader of the future. It's not just a way of saying. I think that's the reality. And if they remain committed to these values, we're going to have a better world.
Thank you. I'm now inspired. I would like to go on, but I'm getting the virtual hook and told I need to provide some wrap-up comments. So a virtual thank you and huge applause to all three of you. It's just a wonderful, meaningful discussion. So before leaving today, we wanted to share some information on upcoming ways to get involved with social impact at Booth. Each of these opportunities is on the events page of the Stigler Center website. Lastly, we'd love to get your feedback on today's event, and please fill out the survey that will magically pop up after the webinar ends. And then finally, from the Rustandi and the Stigler Centers, thank you for being here, and we hope to connect with you again soon.